So the term suburbia can mean many different things depending on where you're talking about. Suburbia or suburbs. Because really what the term suburbs essentially means, or suburbia, is any place that is outside of the core inner city but part of the metropolitan area. And it can mean a number of different things depending on what country or continent or region you're talking about. Like, for instance, in Europe, the suburbs there are often largely composed of apartment buildings and townhouses, whereas in the United States, suburbs are predominantly low density single family homes. And even the term single family home, it's a bit interesting how they use the word family as if to imply there's always a family living in it. Whereas other types of housing, they use different terms as if to imply that, like, there's not necessarily a family living in it. There could be just individual people. And that's not entirely true because I have known of cases where you have a detached suburban house with just one person living in it. I actually lived in a place like that for a while as a renter, but my landlady, yeah, she was living there on her own. My point is that in the United States and Canada, suburbia typically means neighborhoods that are dominated by single family homes in a low density living arrangement. However, what I really want to get into in this video is the differences between American suburbia and Canadian suburbia, because they're largely very similar, but in some ways they actually do have certain subtle but still apparent differences. So I want to talk about that right now. The first thing, I would say the biggest difference, is that Canadian suburbs more often have a certain amount of high-rise apartment buildings and also low-rise apartment buildings and townhouse complexes interspersed amongst the single-family homes. And there can often be clusters where you have a lot of apartment buildings and also townhouses together in one area. And those areas are often a bit poorer and sometimes can sort of be like little mini ghettos in a way, but not always. Like, they vary a lot. Some of these neighborhoods are outright ghettos, and others are just kind of like, lower middle class areas that, might have a little bit of a higher crime rate than the surrounding low density suburbs, but aren't like straight up hoods per se. That's a common thing throughout Canada, not only in the major metropolitan areas, but also in the smaller cities, like even cities of like 50,000 or so. You get that, a lot of that in Canada. In the United States, not so much. A lot of the suburbs in the United States are overwhelmingly single-family homes, and when you do get anything other than single-family homes, it's often just townhomes or semi-detached and maybe the occasional low-rise apartment building. But you don't have nearly as many suburbs in the United States that are composed of, this mixture of high rises and large clusters of high rises, but also detached homes as well. There are some exceptions, though, because I've noticed Washington, D.C. actually has a lot more of these types of suburbs compared to most American cities. It seems to be more like a Canadian city in that regard. Now, I'm not considering, for instance, like Newark, New Jersey. Like, I'm not considering Newark, New Jersey, or Fort Worth, Texas, or like San Jose, California as suburbs. I would consider those like secondary cities within a metropolitan area. But in terms of actual suburbs, yeah, like there's not that as much of that in the United States compared to Canadian suburbs. And I think it's partly because in the US, the NIMBYism, not in my backyardism, is stronger than in Canada, although it's still pretty strong here. But I think it's even stronger in the US, and that's probably because The US, its ghettos tend to be worse than our ghettos. And the US has a lot more places with like absurdly high crime rates. Um, Even though the crime rate isn't that different overall in every crime except murder, but I think what it is that in Canada the differentials in crime rates are less extreme than in the US. So their worst places are a lot worse than many of our worst places, with the exception of Winnipeg's actually pretty bad for every crime except murder. Although even in terms of murder, it's by far the worst of any major Canadian city. It's just not that bad by the standards of major American cities. It might have the highest murder rate of any city its size in a first world country outside the United States, though, which is interesting. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, like the worst American cities are a lot worse than ours. So yeah, I think that's a big part of why that is that American suburbs are much more resistant to like non-single family home types of housing, and especially to high-rise apartment buildings. Like there's definitely a strong sense in American suburbs that they don't want high-rise apartments anywhere near them. And insofar as they do have things like townhomes or low-rise apartment buildings or even semi-detached homes, I find that in American suburbs they don't want too many of them, and they don't want too many of them in a cluster together. Whereas in Canadian suburbs, it's a bit more common. Although, again, not everywhere. Like, we do have some suburbs in Canada that are a bit more like American suburbs where you have large areas with hardly any apartment buildings. Like, for instance, and not much like even townhouses and stuff. Like, for instance, some of the more northern parts of York region are like that in the Toronto area, like Aurora, Newmarket, and northern Richmond Hill. And same with, for instance, some of the further out parts of Halton region, like the northern parts of Burlington and some of the northwestern parts of Oakville, where you get large areas where there's almost exclusively single family homes. But again, it's not quite to that extent because much of GTA suburbia is actually a mixture of single family homes, but with sort of denser stuff interspersed, like high rises and such. Like the majority of the GTA suburbs are like that, the Greater Toronto area. But the thing is, though, even these areas, they're not walkable, so they're still suburban, because even when you have these big clusters of high-rise apartment buildings close together, they tend to be around stroads, and there's not great public transit. There's just buses, and they're not always even that frequent. And you have massive like 4 or 6 lane or 8 lane stroads, and yeah, it's not terribly walkable. There's a lot of European suburbs are like that actually. So with the high rise apartment buildings and the stroads and the lack of like street life and lack of mixed use, that's another thing. There's still the separation of how like residential and commercial. So it does feel still suburban in that regard, in that it's car dependent, not great public transit, and not that much like mixed use. And also just like the design of it is modernist. Like you have the kind of tower in the park style apartment buildings as opposed to like anything that would resemble older like European style, like old Europe style apartment buildings. Like there's nothing like that. So yeah, it's still modernist, like Le Corbusier inspired or whatever. Um, but yeah, there's a lot more of that in Canadian suburbs. But again, it's not everywhere. Like you do have some Canadian suburbs that are still very much like American ones, where it's almost exclusively single family homes. But yeah, that's one difference. A second difference is that in the newer Canadian suburbs, well, these things kind of two things that tie together is that I find that there's stricter regulations in terms of sprawl going beyond municipal boundaries. So you often have cases where there's a very definitive line between the edge of the suburbs and where the farmland begins, and you can see it. Like you could see it from Google Street View, you could see it from an airplane, You can see it when you're driving through the area. It like the farmland will dramatically stop, and there will often be a road that divides the farmland from the edge of the suburbs, and it's often determined by municipal boundaries. Whereas in the United States, the suburbs, they don't really stop. They kind of just peter out and seem to sprawl in every direction and then slowly and gradually transition into rural areas. I mean, there's a bit of that in Canada, but I'd say not as much. I'd say in Canada, there seems to be a bit more regulation about where the suburbs end and where the rural areas begin. And I mean, obviously, the suburbs continue to expand outward, but they do so in a more orderly way where it seems to be like there still seems to be a dividing line. It's just they'll change where the dividing line is based on further growth. But there seems to be some like organization to it. Like there seems to be some order and some planning and some amount of like municipal boundary establishment. Whereas in the United States, it just often just goes out in every direction like tentacles from an octopus and eventually just sort of peters out and subsides. And in line with that, with these municipal growth boundaries, another difference is that in a lot of the more recent Canadian suburbs, you have a lot more cases where the houses are closer together because I think they're trying to squeeze as many houses as possible into these areas, but they still make the houses really big. So you have this interesting phenomenon, and this is really more true of the newer suburbs. It's not really the case with the older ones, but I'd say with suburbs built in like the 1990s or 2000s or later, you have a lot of cases of these really, really big suburban houses, like even like McMansion level big, but they're really close together. And it looks kind of odd, frankly. I personally think what would look better is if the houses were as close together, but they were less, like they could be like taller or just smaller in general. But it looks really weird when you have these huge boxy houses that are close together. I mean, again, like they look ugly regardless of whether they're next to each other or like really close together or not. But my point is it's kind of a bizarre quirk of Canadian suburbia where it's like I guess they're trying to make it sprawl a bit less, but it still is sprawl just because the houses are so damn big. And also, even though the houses are close together, like they still sometimes have big backyards. So yeah, like I mean the backyards will be big because they go deep. Like they even though the houses are close together. Plus the width of the house, like even though the houses are close together, they're still pretty wide because they're just massive. Like they have massive square footage. So yeah, that's another interesting quirk of Canadian suburbia, and from what I've seen in the United States, that sort of thing is not quite as common there. So yeah, I would say overall those are the main things that differentiate Canadian suburbia from American suburbia because they're both very similar in that they're dominated by massive stroads, by chain stores, strip malls, and things like that, and overwhelmingly the vast majority of dwellings are single family homes. But nonetheless, there are those subtle differences between Canadian suburbia and American suburbia.